So let's do one thing. Let's now try to understand the basic things which I told you. This whole constitution, 1791, 1793, 1795, 1799, and we'll try to now go into the basic details of what we call as the French Revolution. So now I am going into the details, fine details. Now you know the basic story of these four constitutions. We have to start from 1789, reach 1815. In between 1804 is there, and we'll talk about how Napoleon captured power, how he will go to war with Austria, Prussia, and defeat the Holy Roman Empire and these two powers, but how he will become technically powerless against the British, and then the Moscow campaign, which will be suicidal, and then Waterloo. So, Calon called the Assembly of Notables in 1787. Calon convoked an Assembly of Notables with representations of the three estates. He proposed systemic reform and in administration, and specifically taxation of the first and second estate. The Assembly of Notables opposed the reforms and no steps were taken. However, Calon will be sacked by Louis XVI because he had proposed the first and the second estate waiving taxes. Now what will happen is his replacement, Brigney, is going to come with a solution that on May 5th, 1789, the Estate General will be called with the three estates. The representatives of the three estates will meet, and the basic idea was that the two votes of the first and second estate will just ask the people to pay more taxes. However, feuds, debates, and discussions among the third estate started to develop. And as I told you, when they went to Louis XVI, he gave an ambiguous answer. So on June 17th, 1789, the third estate passed what is called the National Assembly resolution, that if our demands are not accepted, we will become the National Assembly and we will ask for more. Now, the basic point is, hereafter what is going to happen, as I told you, 1787, the Assembly of Notables, Estate General, May 1789, Tennis Court Oath is going to come on July 17, 1789, and then the storming of Bastille on 14th July, 1789. Now, that will be followed by what is called the August Decrees, which I told you, Declaration of Man and the Citizen, then First Constitution, and the flight of Louis XVI, which is technically introduced the next phase, which is the 1793 Constitution. So, basically, the Tennis Court Oath was, what was it? It was the oath by the National Assembly that we will not dissolve or we will not leave until we write a new constitution, and that new constitution was very, very important. More priests and nobles started to join, and the Estate General was now fully replaced by the National Assembly. And the National Assembly was riled up or based on a very important pamphlet which was actually circulated. So Sayes had released a very important pamphlet, said what is the third estate, and it was to mobilize the people, and this became the basic background under which the Tennis Court Oath is taken. He asked, what is the third estate? Everything. What it has been until now in political order? Nothing. And what does it ask to be? It asks to be become something. This was technically used to mobilize the people behind the back of the king. Now, the Tennis Court Oath has been taken that the constitution, until unless it is not written, it will not dissolve itself. So the people now started to feel that the army is moving in and around, so maybe Louis XVI will try to quench it. So the shortage of food and inflation led to rumors. People started rioting on the streets. Commoners stormed the Bastille, a major prison fortress, and the Royal Armory to get what we call as the basic arms and ammunition to protect the National Assembly. And what happens after this is, the basic fact is, on 14 July, the Bastille is broken and it is declared as the National Day. The tricolor, as we know as the French flag, is waved for the first time. Formation of the Paris Commune, a municipal government as a parallel government to the king. And Lafayette, a noble, will be appointed as the commander-in-chief of what we call as the National Guard, which is going to technically be protector of the National Assembly. But as I told you, it's a long process to write a constitution. So the great fear was back. The fact that there was still lack of grains and increased prices. Rumors were spreading. Peasants attacked the manors and estates. Now the National Assembly has to respond, because people are feeling more and more fearful. Writing a constitution is one thing, but the basic problems of France have not gone anywhere else. Now, what happens is that on 4th August 1789, the August Decree had 18 ordinances which abolished the feudal regime, tithe, which is a tax which was taken by the church, old judicial system, sale of administrative offices. So basically, they start to dismantle the order system. And on 26th August 1789, the Declaration of Right was prepared by Sayce and Lafayette in consultation with Thomas Jefferson, who we already discussed in the American Revolution. And this document will technically become the mother of all constitutions because it had a lot of important concepts. So, what was the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen? The basic point is citizenship is limited, it is only about man. This is the flaws. It argued, the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen, it argued that all men have natural rights by birth, and these rights were right to individual security, right to freedom, right to equality, and right to property. And you just try to see the parallels between our constitution and what ideas are being talked about. He said that law is the expression of common will, and equality before law was very, very important. So you can see how our fundamental rights are coming out of this. Then he said no arrest without a judicial order, very important. Guarantee of freedom of speech and press. These are all laid down by the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen, which will become the preamble for the Constitution itself. Security of public rights is the duty of the state. Sovereignty was vested in the nation instead of the state or parliament. Basically, the people were supreme and they gave the sovereignty to the state. Further, man is invested with some natural rights which he acquired by birth, and the rights of individual is in this way very, very important. Law is the expression of common will. Everybody is equal before the law. Nobody should be arrested unlawfully, very, very important. Further, what we see, the freedom of speech and press is guaranteed. Security of public rights is the duty of the state. Sovereignty in the people. All people have the right to acquire government ranks based on merits, so it's not about nomination. Private property is an inviolable and unbreachable right, and the basic point was nobody should be deprived of it. Then the next most important, which is that all are free to diffuse religion and thoughts provided they do not violate the limits prescribed by law. So you can spread your religion but not violate law. Freedom lies in those activities that do not harm others, reasonable restriction. All officers are accountable to the public. It was about accountability. These ideas, which were generally based on separation of power, the idea of natural rights, justice, equality, freedom, liberty, all are extremely important. So technically, the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen is an expression of Enlightenment ideas and one of the most key documents for the world itself. This was the major contribution of the French Revolution because it itself was a failure, but it gave to us these basic rights. Now, significance, as I said, reflects the ideals of the Enlightenment. Restrictions on the authority of the monarch preventing despotism was very, very important. Basically, basis of all future French constitutions. The Bible of modern age affected the constitution of several countries, even India. So now the point was, how were these ideas spreading across France? And therein comes the role of saloons as a very important public institution. So these saloons now became the places where different ideas were being discussed, debated, and disseminated. These were organized gatherings of philosophers, generally hosted by prominent women, where come in the role of women itself, because they were now spreading the French revolutionary ideas, the ideas of enlightenment. Discuss topics from literature, politics, and science. Meeting point of all classes, and these ideals, the spread of enlightenment ideals, become very, very important in the way the declaration comes through. So this is one of the institutions which is seen as a very important concept in creating a new political culture. And that new political culture was based on the ideas that people need to discuss. The fact that debates are important, the fact that there is agreement, there's a disagreement. And this is why the French Revolution's legacy is bigger, because this becomes a part and parcel of European politics. Further, women were extremely important in spreading the ideals of the French Revolution. No political rights and generally were subordinated to men, and the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen will not give them more. Still, women demanded equality and end to male. A very important personality in that regard was Olympe de Gouges, who actually was a very prominent personality when it comes to women philosophers, and he will even respond to the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen with the declaration. will respond with an important document which is called the Declaration of the Right of the Woman and the Female Citizen in response to what we call as the discrimination of the basic declarations. So the chief modes which were used by them were pamphlets, writings, women's clubs, and they even marched to Versailles, and they were also the ones who will capture the king in Tuileries. So Ulam the Gouge, Declaration of Right of Women and the Female Citizen in 1791 in response to what we call as with the flaws of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Now the basic point is that the issues still remain, and this declaration was very, very limited. And as I said, women are not part of it. So the Declaration of Right of Man and Citizen is a very limited document. No duties, thus a recipe for anarchy, that you have all the powers but technically no duty towards the state. Protected the interest of the middle class only, and slavery continued in France. No guaranteed about how these rights will be enforced. No rights to passive citizens, including women, children, slaves, and foreigners. And citizens were divided into active and passive, only given to active citizens. And this active and passive concept was whoever pays taxes is technically an active citizen. So it was technically the declaration of the rights of an active citizen and man. And basically, this was the basic issue with the French Revolution, that it was still based on small conservative ideas which was coming out of the Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizen. Now, all this in turn will lead to, and you don't need to technically go through the course in a lot of detail, you need to just understand the basic progression of what is happening. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen will become the preamble for the Constitution of 1791, the first constitution, which will make it into a constitutional monarchy, and the Legislative Assembly will become the sovereign body itself. It will also exercise a lot of power over other things. So the provisions: suspensive vote to the king to overrule the Legislative Assembly, separation of powers was maintained, no war and peace without the approval from the Legislative Assembly, which the Girondinists will do, and the judges were now elected by the people. The 1791 Constitution is very, very important because it will become a very important document for the Constitution or the constitutional history of France. The king initially refused to recognize the Declaration of Rights. So what we see is the march of women to Versailles on 5th October 1789. The abolition of the tithe, and now which was levied by the church, was also a major blow to the church itself. Nationalization of church property had started. Basically, now the rationalism of the French Revolution was taking away the power from the church. National system of elected clergy, and basically circumstances of civil war due to the anti-clerical attitude of the French Revolution itself. So the people still believed in the church, but basically there's a tensions are rising. The king will initially refuse, but once the women's march will happen on Versailles, he will have to accept it because he had no other option. So now, under the pressure of signing this document, he will try to escape to Austria, but will be captured. And this in turn will now be context in which the first French Republic will come. As I told you, 1791 Constitution will come. 1792 they will go to war under the Girondinist influence. 1793 there will be a new wave of protest, and that in turn will lead to the first French Republic through the 1793 Constitution. So now first we need to understand the rising tension, which is that how France will go to war with Austria. So there were secret negotiations which were happening between Louis XVI and King of Prussia. These rulers did not want the French Revolution to spread beyond France. So in April of 1792, Legislative Assembly will declare war, which was technically Girondinists controlled, and we'll talk about the Girondinists and Jacobians very quickly. But a lot of people will volunteer for the war against Prussia and Austria, war of the people against the war of aristocrats, and that was the rest of Europe. Basically, the war was about protecting the French Revolution, but war does not help when there is already too much economic crisis. And the basic point was that this will in turn lead to losses, economic difficulties to the people, and now the Jacobians, who are the next political party, are going to accuse the Girondinists of going into an unnecessary war. Men were fighting war and women were earning and doing housework. The constitution, political rights to the richer section only, and political clubs now will start to technically reject the Girondinist concept and the loyalist concept. And this in turn will lead to factionalism within the Legislative Assembly into Jacobians and Girondinists. Jacobians, as I told you, was the radical group, and now the basic point was the French Revolution was still not complete. People wanted more. So, radical tendencies of the public were still there. Demands for a republic. Political clubs will start to rally this point. Riots will start on the streets, and demand for social equality was very, very important. So, basically, what we see here is that the French Revolution from 1791 was not still, the people were still not very, very satisfied with the outcomes of this. So the basic point was the Jacobians will start to now embody the basic interest of the people. Remember, the French Revolution causes are very, very important. Course, it's just this progression. There's nothing here. Basically, from 1791 to 93 to 95 to 1799, we just need to see how change is coming. So Jacobians will start to become more and more popular because the Girondinists were in a, who technically dominated the legislative assembly, were in an unnecessary war, and the Jacobians will now say enough is enough. We need to capture power in order to change the course of French history. So they wanted to drive the revolution towards an establishment of a republic consisted of deputies, leading thinkers, progressive members of society. They sat on the left of the legislative assembly as a minority. That is why they were called the left. And they were also called sans-culottes because they used to wear a different type of dress which was without collars or without buttons on their collars, which is called sans-culottes, without buttons. Now, the Jacobean club, now controlled by a person called Maximilian Robespierre, is going to become extremely influential in politics. Less prosperous section of the society wanted more from the French Revolution. Small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, servants, and daily wage workers. Attire similar to dock workers, long striped trousers were there, and distinct fashionable section of the society, and tried to show that they were distinct from other, such as the nobles and the clergy. The basic point is 1791 constitution is there, 1792 they're at war, but the legislative assembly is getting divided into a Jacobian and a Girondinist faction. Jacobians are becoming more and more radical. They don't trust the king. While the Girondinists are loyalists, they're technically moderates, wanted constitutional monarchy, believed that the king was very, very important. They were lawyers, intellectuals, journalists, and they did not want the French Revolution to become too radical. Sat on the right, that is why they call the rightists, and the concept of left and right comes to the French Revolution itself. Now, the basic point is on 10th August 1792, a major moment will come because again the king will try to flee to Austria, and here he moved first to Tuileries, but Tuileries he will be captured. Armed revolutionaries of Saint-Cloud stormed the palace of Tuileries, took the royal family captive, and marked this led to the fall of the Girondinists and the loyalists and the king. Monarchy was suspended and the National Convention was established, which was now going to be fully dominated by the Jacobians. And it is in this context that France will become a republic and the 1793 constitution will come through. Radicals who now fully controlled what is called the Legislative Assembly, but they renamed it to the National Convention, which will write the new constitution. On 21st September 1792, they abolished the monarchy and found the first republic itself, and the king and the queen were executed, and France declared a preemptive war with Britain, Holland, Spain, and Hungary, all what are called constitutional monarchies or absolutist monarchies. The basic point is that France has now become a republic. However, they had to produce a constitution in 1793, a republican constitution. Rather than doing that, Maximilian Robespierre, who was technically the leader of the Jacobians, he argues that we need to cleanse the society of loyalists and he will introduce the reign of terror. Role of Robespierre, he was a very important personality as a leader in the Jacobians. Regime sought to execute via guillotine all who opposed the French Revolution, and this will become his basic way of doing justice. And he will first dismantle the ancient regime. New calendar will be introduced in 1793. New revolutionary symbols such as female image of liberty and republic, and de-Christianization and the development of what are called temples of reason rather than temple of religion was happening. But the basic point was that between 1792-93, Jacobians take control, and between 1793-94, in the name of cleansing the society, Robespierre introduced what is called the Committee of General Safety and Committee of Public Safety. He will start to guillotine anybody and everybody, and this will in turn lead to what we call as the Reign of Terror. Now the Girondinists and the people will start to realize that he was going out of hand. So in the July month of the new calendar, which is called the Thermidorian reaction, happened, in which the French month of Thermidor, July 1794, the Girondinists arrested Robespierre and his allies. Control of Girondinists guillotined Robespierre and his allies. Paris Commune was dismantled and Jacobean Con was banned. Finally, the reign of terror was over, because technically Robespierre had fully derailed the whole French Revolution, because in the name of French Revolution he was doing anything and everything. And they will write their next constitution, which is the 1795 constitution. But the basic point is, why the reaction? Why the Thermidorian reaction? Robespierre turned the revolution upside down, executed his own friend Danton, who's the first president of the Committee of Public Safety, by insecure and intolerant Robespierre. Women rights activists such as Olympe de Gouges, influential philosophers such as Condorcet were actually guillotined. So basically, he fully squashed dissent. If you don't agree with Robespierre, then you go home or you die. Basically, the point is that now the French Revolution is off the rails. It started in 1791 with constitutional monarchy. 1793, it technically became a republican. But between 1793 and 95, it has been fully taken over by the Jacobians. Too radical, Robespierre had now introduced a full reign of violence, which we call as the Reign of Terror. Now, finally, they will write another constitution, and that is called the Directory Rule in 1795, which is the fall of the Jacobean government will come through. Wealthier middle class seize power. They want some form of stability. So they finally introduce this concept of 5 directors and controlling 2 houses of legislature. And these 5 directors, why? Because no one can actually control power. But this in turn will also become a problem. Bicameral legislation, directory, collective executive, 5 directors as collective executives. Now, the point is, power and prestige of the French army was increasing at this point of time, because they were able to hold off in the war. If you remember, since 1792, the war is happening in the background itself. And the political instability of the Directory will lead to the rise of dictator, but nothing but Napoleon. And the restoration of monarchy finally in France will happen in 1815. So technically what is going to happen is, because of the insecurities of the directors, and when the directors themselves will try to capture power, says himself in 1797, the basic idea was now directors themselves were conspiring to capture power. So it was the political instability of the Directory, and which in turn led to Napoleon coming to power, and he in turn will lead to the restoration of the French monarchy in 1815. The basic point is that this Directory rule will in turn lead to the Consulate rule in 1799. Between 1795 to 1799, the longest period of any form of stability. In between, in 1797, there's an attempt of coup in the director's side to capture power. Napoleon will have enough, and we'll talk about who is Napoleon, and he will technically take over, one of the greatest generals of France, and in turn lead to the French Revolution, coming to this end of phase, what we call as the French Revolution phase. Now we will go into the Napoleonic phase. So there are actually 4 phases, and I'm going to give you a small summary here. First phase is the National Assembly phase, where the bourgeoisie wanted to end the rule of the king, and basically 1789 to 91 is the most revolutionary phase, true to the French revolutionary ideals. The second phase in turn is when the Legislative Assembly will come through, and it is about should there be a king or should there not be a king. Then we have what is called the extremist phase, which is when the whole revolution will go out of the rails, National Convention or Reign of Terror phase, and then the Directory phase. Basically, France had gone through a very important cycle of being a constitutional monarchy to republic to now under directories to then under consulate. Remember, the whole course of the French Revolution is not a question which is going to be asked in the exam, because it's too long to be asked in 250, 150 word question. Basically, what I'm trying to argue for the past half an hour, 45 minutes is that the fact that the French Revolution is a paradoxical event. France never became fully stable. 1791, first constitution, 1793, second constitution, this you need to remember. Then 1795, third constitution, 1799, fourth constitution, four constitutions. This tells you that revolutions need to be stable. There was no stability in the revolution. This in turn is the problem. And by that time, we come to 1799, Napoleon was the only person who everybody supported because he was the one of the greatest, was fighting for a very, very long time since 1792 with the Austrians and the Prussians. He was considered a very important administrator, and that is for the point at which we see that Napoleon is going to come to power.